I started with the earthquake because that is how everyone tells it. The ground convulsed before dawn, the city split open, gas lines ruptured, water mains failed, and fire moved through San Francisco like the second half of a sentence already written by disaster. It sounded complete. Earthquake, fire, ruin. But then I began reading the orders issued after the shaking stopped, looking at the photographs taken while the smoke still hung over the streets, tracing where explosives were used and what was still standing when they were. And the story changed. Because some of what vanished in 1906 may not have been lost to flame alone. By the time San Francisco enters popular memory, it has already been simplified. The earthquake comes first, the fire comes second, and the destruction appears so overwhelming that no further distinction seems necessary. Streets tear open, walls crack, chimneys fall, gas lines rupture beneath the city. Water mains fail just when they are needed most. Buildings shed facades into the streets. Cornices plunge, towers split, windows burst, and within minutes the city seems to move from catastrophe into inevitability. Once the shaking stops, the rest of the story appears to right itself. Fire follows damage. Damage becomes ruin. Ruin becomes history. That is the version people keep because it is easy to carry. A clean disaster offers emotional relief. It has sequence, clarity, and a single direction of blame. Nature strikes. Human beings endure. A city is lost. But the moment you begin separating what the earthquake did from what officials, soldiers, firefighters, and improvised authorities did afterward, the story becomes harder to hold in one shape. San Francisco in 1906 was not a blank field overtaken by a single force. It was a crowded commercial city, layered with wealth, poverty, speculation, politics, civic ambition, aging infrastructure, and districts of very different value to the people who governed, insured, financed, and imagined its future. None of that disappeared when the ground moved. The fires did not begin everywhere at once. They flared in multiple places, fed by ruptured gas mains, damaged stoves, broken chimneys, industrial stores, and the ordinary density of an urban landscape suddenly turned unstable. In another disaster, the city might still have fought back in the usual ways. Hydrants, hose lines, pressure, containment, organized response. But one of the earthquake's most consequential blows had fallen below the surface. Water mains were shattered across key areas. Fire crews arrived at burning blocks with discipline, experience, and urgency, but often without the one thing that could turn effort into control. The city had men. It had engines. It had orders. What it did not have in too many places was water. That fact explains the desperation, and the desperation explains what came next. It does not by itself explain everything. Once it became clear that fire could not always be met with suppression, another logic took hold. If flames could not be extinguished, then perhaps they could be starved. Create breaks, remove fuel, open gaps in the urban fabric, sacrifice one part to preserve another. In principle, the strategy was neither irrational nor unique. Cities under fire have long turned to demolition when ordinary means failed. But the rationality of a method depends entirely on how narrowly, how skillfully, and how truthfully it is applied. Under extreme pressure, violent methods expand fast. They drift from tactic into reflex. And in San Francisco, the record shows demolition becoming not a marginal measure, but one of the defining acts of the disaster. Buildings were dynamited. Walls were blown outward. Roof lines were collapsed deliberately. Entire stretches of blocks were treated as combustible material to be removed rather than urban space to be defended. Some of these acts were ordered under military supervision. Some were carried out by firefighters. Some fell to hurried civilian teams, men operating amid smoke, rumor, heat, fractured command, and the terrible confidence produced by emergency. Contemporary accounts describe explosives placed against structures believed to threaten surrounding areas, but also explosions that did not behave as intended. Burning debris was hurled into adjacent blocks. Fires spread beyond newly made breaks. Structures that might have remained barriers became kindling fields. What was meant to halt the fire sometimes widened it. That is the first fracture in the familiar narrative, because once explosives enter the story, the meaning of destruction changes. A building consumed by uncontrolled flame belongs to one category of loss. A building shattered by order, in anticipation of flame, belongs to another. A block damaged by earthquake but rendered unsalvageable through failed demolition belongs to another still. Later memory can fuse all of that into one image of total inferno. It can let the glow swallow the sequence. But history becomes less honest each time it does. The difference matters physically, because different forces leave different kinds of ruin. It matters morally, because unavoidable loss and chosen sacrifice are not the same thing. And it matters structurally, because once every vanished building is folded into the fire, human decision disappears into spectacle. The photographs are what keep disturbing that simplification. In some, the scale of devastation seems absolute, so complete that no serious argument about salvage feels possible. Streets are reduced to masonry fields. Iron twists above rubble. Districts appear flayed to their foundations. But in other images, the record becomes harder to read cleanly. Isolated walls remain high and straight. Facades stand above wrecked interiors. Adjacent structures show sharply uneven outcomes. Some shells appear damaged, yes, but not erased by the kind of total collapse later summaries imply. That does not prove the city could simply have been saved by greater wisdom or better luck. It does suggest something more unsettling, that between clearly doomed and clearly recoverable, there existed a broad zone of ambiguity, and that many buildings may have crossed out of that zone, not because fire left no alternative, but because decisions did. Even the language used afterward begins to compress too quickly. Districts are called destroyed. Buildings are called lost. Blocks are called gone. But destroyed can mean burned, blasted, abandoned, condemned, cleared, or left to deteriorate until clearance becomes inevitable. Gone can describe a physical fact or an administrative conclusion. In a crisis, those meanings blur fast. Once they blur, they stop attracting scrutiny. And this is where the disaster stops being only a story about flame. San Francisco was a city of property lines, commercial corridors, boarding houses, hotels, offices, warehouses, municipal records, and civic prestige. To declare a block expendable was never purely technical. Every demolition passed through a landscape of unequal value. Some districts mattered more to insurance exposure. Some mattered more to sanitation arguments. Some mattered more to merchants, developers, transport planners, and officials already imagining how reconstruction could produce a cleaner, safer, more legible city than the one that had existed the day before the earthquake. Disaster narrows time, but it expands authority. Men who would have faced years of obstruction in peacetime suddenly move beneath the cover of necessity, and necessity is one of those words history uses when it wants outcomes without too much examination of how they were reached. So the question is not whether the 1906 fire was real. Of course it was. Nor is the question whether some demolitions were justified. Under those conditions, some clearly were. The harder question is where emergency ended and enlargement began, where valid firebreak logic became overreach, where damaged but standing structures stopped being evaluated as wounded pieces of a city and started being treated as acceptable losses inside a broader vision of what San Francisco would become after the smoke cleared. A city can be physically injured and politically abandoned at the same time. It can remain partially standing and still be judged by the right people at the right moment as more useful erased than repaired. That possibility proves nothing on its own, but it changes how every blast, every order, every photograph, and every later summary must be read. Because the moment demolition becomes central rather than incidental, the old story begins to fail. San Francisco was not only a city overtaken by catastrophe, it was also a city passing into the hands of people forced to decide, very quickly, what would be defended, what would be sacrificed, and what kind of future could be built more easily if too much of the damaged city did not survive long enough to resist replacement. The longer you stay with the aftermath, the less the word necessary feels like an explanation, and the more it feels like a cover stretched over many different kinds of action. Some of those actions were surely unavoidable. A city with broken mains, advancing fire fronts, collapsing communications, an entire district slipping out of control cannot be judged as though everyone involved had calm offices, complete maps, and time to think. Men were deciding in smoke, heat, rumor, and fear. But that is precisely why the record should be read more carefully, not more generously. Emergency can explain confusion. It cannot automatically redeem every outcome confusion produced. What happens in memory is more revealing than what happens in the flames. The earthquake remains the opening shock. The fire becomes the great destroyer, and everything else begins to disappear inside that image. Blasting, clearance, condemnation, abandonment, structural damage, failed firebreaks, hurried removal, later demolition, and administrative decisions all merge into one smooth phrase: San Francisco burned. It is emotionally satisfying because it removes sequence. It is historically useful because it removes agency. Once all losses are absorbed into the fire, almost no one has to ask which buildings were truly consumed by it, which were exposed to it, which were damaged by earthquake alone, and which may have been carried past recovery by human choice. That compression matters because the city before 1906 was not merely vulnerable. It was unfinished in the eyes of many people who held power over it. San Francisco was wealthy but uneven, dense but inefficient, grand in places, improvised in others. It contained aging commercial stretches, packed immigrant neighborhoods, vulnerable residential blocks, expensive hotels, warehouses, civic buildings, transport corridors, and parcels of land whose future value depended heavily on what came next. Disaster did not erase those interests. It intensified them. The same catastrophe that produced genuine emergency also produced a rare political condition. Decisions could be made fast, objections could be silenced, and the future of entire districts could be settled under the moral shelter of crisis. This is where demolition stops looking like a technical response alone and begins to look like a hinge between catastrophe and redesign. If a building is collapsing into flame, and explosives are used to deny that fire new fuel, the logic is brutal but understandable. If a structurally unsound shell is later cleared because it threatens public safety, that belongs to another category. But between those two poles lies a broad middle ground where motives blur. A damaged structure may be treated as unsalvageable before careful evaluation. A block may be written off because defending it seems too costly, too uncertain, or simply less useful than clearing it. A district that had long invited criticism for congestion, building quality, sanitation, or disorder may suddenly become easier to erase than to repair. Under such conditions, destruction can remain real while still becoming selective. And selective destruction is exactly the kind most likely to vanish inside public legend. The surviving visual record keeps pointing back to that ambiguity. Some photographs show devastation so complete that argument seems almost indecent. Others do something stranger. They preserve fragments that look less like absolute annihilation and more like interrupted continuity. High walls remain. Facades survive over empty interiors. Street lines are still readable. Structural shells stand in ways that suggest injury rather than total disappearance. Fire can certainly leave such scenes behind. So can earthquake damage. So can later condemnation. That is the problem. The image does not always tell you which force completed the loss. Only that later memory has chosen to stop caring about the distinction. And once the distinction is lost, the new city begins to justify the old city's disappearance. Rebuilding has a way of laundering destruction. A stronger water system, stricter codes, modernized commercial blocks, cleaner alignments, safer construction, grander planning language, and renewed civic pride all make the violence of transition seem easier to accept. If the rebuilt city appears more orderly and more successful, then what vanished can be recast as necessary sacrifice. The future reaches backward and blesses the scale of loss. Progress does not erase the methods used to make room for itself, but it does soften them. It turns argument into inevitability. It makes replacement feel like rescue. That may be the deepest simplification in the whole story. Not that San Francisco was destroyed, but that the destruction is remembered as singular. Earthquake, fire, end. Yet the closer you read the accounts, the less singular it appears. Some buildings were broken by the shaking beyond practical recovery. Some districts were consumed by uncontrollable fire. Some structures were likely doomed the moment the mains failed. But there are also signs of something more historical and less convenient. A city passing through a zone where fear, urgency, authority, technical failure, opportunism, and civic ambition all began acting on the same landscape at once. Not a tidy conspiracy. Something more believable than that. A crisis large enough to hide overreach inside necessity and reinvention inside grief. That is why the phrase "could be saved" has to be used carefully. It does not mean the whole city waited for an easy rescue that never came. It means that between total survival and total ruin, there may have been more recoverable ground than the legend permits. Salvageable does not mean untouched. Recoverable does not mean safe. But neither word means hopeless. Cities are often decided in precisely that uncertain territory, where officials call one future realistic and another impossible before the evidence has fully settled. In those moments, what survives physically can still be killed politically. A damaged city can be judged too inconvenient to preserve in its existing form. And once that judgment is made under emergency conditions, it can shape memory for generations. So when we say San Francisco was destroyed in 1906, we should ask what that sentence is hiding. Destroyed by the earth? Yes. Destroyed by fire? Certainly. But perhaps also destroyed by decisions later absorbed so completely into the legend that they no longer look like decisions at all. The city that rose afterward became a symbol of resilience. And in many ways it was. But symbols simplify. They smooth over sequence. They fold sacrifice, error, force, opportunity, and planning into one noble image of rebirth. What may have been buried beneath that image is the harder question the photographs and reports still leave behind. How much of old San Francisco was truly taken by flame, and how much of it disappeared because disaster gave powerful men the chance to finish, clear, and replace a damaged city before it could argue for its own survival.